Janet, storytelling. I understand you grew up in an Italian family, and storytelling is a large part of your growing up. And I guess I'm tempted to think that as a consequence, you're steeped in storytelling yourself, and that's a lens through which we can see a lot of your interests. But I'm kind of curious, would you say that storytelling was the hook that, I don't know, made you fascinated by the idea of the artist? I say that because in the long stream of history, you might say, the artist in many respects grows out of storytelling, out of the storyteller. I'm kind of tempted to think that that ancient tradition is part of yours. Any thoughts about that, or other thoughts around the question of what tempted you to become an artist?
Yeah, the idea of storytelling, as you were mentioning, is a big part of, cultural tradition and what I grew up from. My parents immigrated here when they were very young. And they were the only family members from their families that came to Canada. So I was always fascinated hearing these stories of, back home, back in Italy, where they were from and growing up, and, and my dad voyaging across the Atlantic Ocean to come to this new land to work in after, the great devastation of the war, Second World War. So there were a lot of contrasts that were happening. And the idea of storytelling, whether it's being told orally or you're reading about it, sets off little sparks in your imagination. You begin to imagine what that is like, these metaphors that one might use to tell a story. And usually it may be exaggerated. It's never quite, even when you're trying to tell something from memory of what happened, it's not quite the way it happened. And of course, the great storyteller embellishes a moment to, I think, even more so spark that part of the imagination where, depending what it is, it might be scary, it might be more evocative of something grander. And I think some of that has led me into the way I approach, my own work and that trail of an artist, because I always found that there was something beyond that, always in search of, just as you go through a novel and you want to get to the next chapter, because there's, you can get to that point and climax and find out what's behind the bend, so to speak. So, I find storytelling very fascinating. I wouldn't say I'm an oral storyteller, and I've kind of adapted that more through the work I do, whether it's writing about it or creating the artworks. And I'm always looking for a narrative.
Was it this particular narrative you just mentioned about your parents fleeing, you might say, the devastation of the Second World War, which is an entrancing, if also of course fraught experience? Is there something about that, and the embellishment, of course, as you say, that in your early life set you on a path, a course towards, let's say, art school?
Oh, that's a very good question, because I think it set me on a path of creativity at first, and looking for that other, and how to maybe express that, and to find where I am, in a way, because coming from an immigrant family and growing up, I think in that environment, and Canada, I would say, in the 70s, 80s, it was a different wave of generation coming from families who had come over to Canada in the 50s and 60s. So I think you know, I was always trying to find my place here. And I don't know if I have, but I think it makes me look for what is that place, because, you know, and it kind of teeters on this idea also of liminality. And I think a lot of my work as well, particularly my earlier work, you know, I think about this in between space. And I think, you know, that idea of moving from one place to the other, taking on different traditions, I mean, a lot is written about that. And I see, you know, to me, and I think this goes back to a lot of my work, I see that as water too, because there's this ever-changing moment, and, you know, the calm before the storm, you're in that moment. You know what's happened in the past, but where you don't know where you're going to be at the next moment in time.
We'll come back to water, but I like that word liminal, which leads me to think that the artist actually occupies a kind of liminal position in society, that in some respects we're set apart by the culture. We're either seen as gods or goddesses or heroes, or we're seen as somehow irrelevant. Maybe there is a connection between those two things, I'm not sure. But in any case, this liminality, do you see that an odd position, that ambivalent or ambiguous position of the artist as one of its strengths, as something that it can build upon? And is storytelling the key to that liminality, the degree to which, in your case, the question of telling stories, and I like this, bringing in this question of water, telling stories that seem to work around the edge between the sea and the land, that also is a liminal position. That's a long question. Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that definitely, because, you know, the liminal is in storytelling, and as an artist, our position can be one like that, you know, because you're looking at where things have come from, have developed, and where it might be going, you know, kind of a translator in a way. So through my own work, I kind of see that, you know, still in a space of not necessarily yet at the moment where things have changed into, but knowing there is this change coming, and interpreting things and around us. So, and, you know, I think the idea liminality has been around for a while, a lot, you know, and this is where it connects again with storytelling, a lot where it's been discussed with literature, and writing, with ritual. And I think, you know, then this comes back again to my own history in storytelling, and, you know, the rituals, those that you bring with you and those that you have to adapt. And as I travel a lot, and I also have lived between different places, you know, growing up here in Toronto, but moving, you know, now to the Middle East, you know, it's also, you know, what cultures, you know, have I brought from two cultures that I belong to into another, and what might I bring back from that? You know, I spent a lot of time in Italy growing up, and I continually visit every year. My family is from a place near Venice, and Venice is a place to me that's quite liminal, and inspires me that way. I've looked at its stories, and, you know, and when I visit there, family tell me about other stories, and then I have to compare the stories I've been brought up with those that they tell me. So, you know, again, I'm very interested in kind of how symbols and metaphors might change slightly.
Death in Venice.
Yes.
I'm thinking as a result of what you're saying that in many respects there has been a recent tradition anyway of the artist as critic, social critic and such. But I'm hearing yourself, Janet, really talking about an older tradition, a tradition of storytelling, embellishment, wonder, perhaps, and awe. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so, definitely. I think it's definitely part of my cultural makeup that I bring with me. And, you sit around the dinner table and tell stories, basically. And I think, where we didn't have so much other family around us, there was also maybe a bit of more nostalgia every time I visited and missing that. Because there's kind of this development that happens around one's history.
Tell me about Atlantis and Sable Island, I guess. Islands in general, perhaps. There's more than one island. But islands, and especially Atlantis, which is a sunken island, I guess you could say, sunken continent. This is a story. And islands seem to breed stories. And I'm kind of curious, I want you to talk about the attraction that these have for you.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been fascinated about Atlantis and thinking about it. It's also the relationship to the various stories like the Great Deluge, the flood, and there's a particular book actually in high school, and I think this is one thing that propelled me into looking at islands in Atlantis, was by a Canadian writer Timothy Finley, Not Wanted on the Voyage, where he retells the story of the Great Flood, but using some of the characters, but in a different way, talking about our society today, which sparked for me a great interest of how do you retell something yet keeping in a new understanding of today. How is it reflected around the world around us? But Atlantis itself, we go back to Plato and the myth that he said been passed, not the myth he said passed down, but the story that's been passed down through poets, etc. But there's a lot of cultures that have talked about this time of the flood and this place that existed, and there's been this idea that this place is somewhere between Santorini and the Strait of Gibraltar, but then if you go down to South America, it's somewhere over there. It moves around. And it was, this story and myth about this great perfect society that, were able to survive and progress on their own, and then,
Would you want to visit Atlantis, Jen?
It's a very good question. In one way, I would say yes, but in others, maybe not. Because sometimes it would break that. It's that idea of expectation and what you might expect to find, and to find something different might, could shatter a whole idea or development that I've had in my mind about the place. So I kind of want to leave it to a bit of imagination there.
I tend to my own history of Atlantis to come back to Donald Duck and his nephews visiting Atlantis. And it's the magic of Disney cartoons suggesting that Atlantis might have been that sticks in my mind is Atlantis. Yeah. And this, whatever you might think of Disney, this is a sense of magic through the comic.
Yes.
But also Sable Island, which is something that you've been more recently interested in, along with the island in the Emirates. Can you talk a little bit, just to give me a sense of how that works for you?
Yeah, I mean, I've become...
You have visited Sable Island.
I have visited.
Unlike Atlantis.
Yes, I'm now an ambassador of Sable Island. as they say. Very few people will probably have the opportunity to visit this place. I mean, it's not an easy place to get to.
And what was your feeling about it?
Oh, it's extraordinary. It's magical. It's ephemeral. It's this, you're in this place in the middle of the Atlantic. And the fog comes in and rolls in, and all of a sudden, it rolls out, and then there's these wonderful wild horses that are just grazing along, couldn't care, what you're doing there, or ask question why you're there.
Sounds like a dream.
It is. It kind of feels that way because, this was my experience from, I've been to many places, but this was the most, I would say, extreme, deserted kind of place, untouched. How many places like this are still left in the world that people haven't really discovered or tried to change?
So we have a fantasy on the one hand with Atlantis, and we have a dreamscape on the other hand with Sable Island. How do you situate yourself between the fantasy and the dream?
Well,
Or is that who you are?
Yeah, I'm quite the dreamer, I would say at times, and I think I look at things through that lens, in terms of sure, reality and the present are here and gone the next.
Right.
But using that, the dream or the fantasy, to talk about ideas, to narrate a story in a different way, is, I believe, it's who I am, or how I situate myself as an artist. So this place, and using Sable Island as a, it's become a metaphor of, it is almost that lost place, and it's quite fascinating. I like reading history about these places, the stories that people have told about things, some which, you question, or also what actually has happened. But, it's been a place that people have tried to inhabit for centuries. It was, it's also known as the graveyard of the Atlantic because so many shipwrecks happened there.
It's supposed to have buried treasure, I understand.
Yes, if you can find it somewhere.
Complete the picture.
Exactly. Dig through that dune. And it's, a place where people tried to make dreams happen, but the place would never allow that moment to go beyond that threshold.
Until you came along.
Yes, of course. So, so that's been my experience and what I've been looking at Sable Island, and taking some of those stories out of there, and looking at them. What does this place mean? What does an island mean to us? We're all kind of islands in our own right. We're always looking for that place of escape. There's a lot about escapism with islands, being at the threshold of something because you're at the edge of something new, or being very isolated, where the great beyond is a bit scary.
So much for John Donne. John, you've used lenticular photography, and there's something alluring about the lenticular experience of an image. Now, I wonder if it has something to do with what you've been saying, the relationship between this lenticular process and what we're talking about in liminality and such. Why lenticular photography?
Well, it's a very, for me, attractive object in a way. It captures one's gaze, and because you can see one image at one moment and then it changes in the next, and you can't really grasp it. It's kind of like a dream state. And I've used lenticular photography. I mean, there's a bit of that maybe nostalgia from Cracker Jack boxes and the blinking eye postcards that one has seen growing up. but that's the technique of it, and it's been used more with advertising, and it's in a historical sense when it's been developed. But I was very interested in that material, how it is so much, can be like a dreamscape, and using it as another dimension. So where you're contrasting one image to the other. So in most of my work where I've used it, instead of usually lenticular photography will transform an action, so like blinking eyes, or might go from an apple to a tiger, which so that's a very kitschy kind of ideas. But I was more interested because it was also had this fluidity about it, like water, and just like how you see maybe a reflection in the surface in a pond, but that gets broken, and you see the pebbles underneath, but then a wave washes over it. And that's how I found lenticular photography to be, and use that with a bit more of a contrast of images changing. And as well, it was also creating a movement in the space where one might walk past it and see something. They try to grasp what they thought they had seen but can't really. So it creates this, I find, or my interest was this again, that in-between state occurs now on the plane of the image.
As you say that and I think about it, it strikes me that, and this hadn't struck me before, but that this lenticularity is almost like a replay, you might say, of history, of memory. That we're caught between the present, the future, and the past. Would it happen?
Yeah, I would say so, because I think that the point of there is an idea of memory. And it also goes back a bit. It connects to storytelling. Where you're trying to recapture that moment, and you want to go back and grasp it, make it longer, possibly. So I think that's So I like how lenticular works as that mechanism, and can be connected to that memory, and then it becomes it's also that memory you just experience, and the memory that you see with images, and triggers this other depending what you've seen.
Do you have an interest in history or art history? Any particular experience about going back into the history of art that you find important for you as an artist?
I mean, I think overall art history has been important. Again, it's a story. It's been told now from various lenses.
Why am I asking this? You come from Italy.
Yeah, so there's a lot of, we had various history books, and a lot on, the Renaissance and all of that. So, those books always fascinate me, flipping through them.
Botticelli.
Botticelli, yes. And, anywhere you go in Italy, you're surrounded by that history. That was a very important part of Western history. And there's a lot of narratives that come at looking at these great paintings or sculptures. And
I have to tell you something I just found out last night. During the Second World War, although cultural artifacts and historical buildings were being bombed and burnt all through Europe, the Allies decreed that Italy should be spared that as much as possible because it was the cradle of Western civilization.
Wow! I never heard of. That's amazing.
So there you go.
Yeah.
History is important.
History is important.
And you grew up with it.
Yes. And my dad actually loves history. As well, not so much art history, but history of the world. There's something that in particularly I've been interested in, has at some point for some reason was in the 1800s and what was happening in Europe, even 1700s. My aunt when she was looking back at her lineage, had connected. There's a painter also named Bellotto, who worked under, I'm going to forget his name.
Famous artist.
Famous artist who painted Venice. So yeah, there's something about the painting, like Turner, for example, you know, and the Romanticism, the age of Romanticism. But then also later looking at curiosity cabinets and that history, and you know, which is more about the collection, the object in the museum. Because to me, you know, those objects hold a story, and they were collecting and creating these stories in these rooms, these dioramas, you know, and the museum creating the diorama is also something that has interested me quite a bit.
To go to a museum is to go to a storyteller.
Yeah, definitely. One of my favorites museum is the Museum of Jurassic Technology in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And that's, you know, that's a museum of storytelling, you know, more about the American, a lot about, you know, these odd American things.
Well, that raises an interesting question too, which because the Museum of Jurassic Technology is also a book about that museum.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious whether reading is as important. Well, after all, if you're a storyteller, you're sure it must be a reader. So what do you read? What do you like to read? What is there? Can you quote a work of literature that you think is more fundamental to you than others?
I don't think one is more fundamental. I mean, overall, to me, fiction. I mean, I love fiction. I love getting lost in these potential ideas, and because these worlds that the word helps me create. You know, it's also an escape from reality, per se. But I also like to read, you know, other ideas about space. For me, is important. Space and sight and how we experience, like Gaston Bachelard.
Oh yeah.
The Poetics of Space.
So now we're talking theory.
Yeah. So I like. I mean, I'm not. You know. What's the word? I like reading some theory, interspersed with stories, I would say. But you know, there was a lot of
embellishing theory.
Embellishing, yes. And yeah, in terms of, you know, there's a lot of different fiction that I've read growing up. You know, I mentioned Timothy Finley. You know, I really enjoyed a lot of his novels that he's written. There are many other writers that, you know, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a particular set of stories. Then you have, you know, Alice in Wonderland and, you know, books like that.
Do you see yourself as Alice?
Sometimes.
Through the looking glass?
Through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole. You know, those magical, fantastical ideas. And, you know, talking about Alice in Wonderland, you know, you're looking at this other space, you know, where The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, they go through this cupboard, closet, wardrobe. They go through the wardrobe and into this, you know, magical land. So, and magic, yeah.
You teach, Jen. In fact, you teach in Dubai, at Zayed University. How exotic can you get from the point of view of Toronto?
Yes.
I'm kind of interested how that's your, I think, in fact, Dubai is where you teach. You've never taught anywhere else, so it's a very specific experience. Yeah. What, I'm going to ask about teaching, but I'm kind of curious about the landscape of the Emirates, of the Middle East. The Middle East is, of course, in the news nightly, and we've become kind of used to one aspect of the Middle East, but of course, especially in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, there's a very different aspect of the Middle East that perhaps people don't necessarily appreciate. I'm kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about your experience of being in the Middle East, at least in the Emirates, and of course you traveled much further than that, but that's where you're teaching and where you're living. If you could talk a little bit about your experience of that landscape and being there, you might say. In a way, I said exotic. The relationship between the exotic and the magical is sometimes quite close. Anyway, any comments?
Yeah. Well, the Middle East is, and particularly the Gulf, which is really most of what we're experienced in Dubai, is very different from our Canadian landscape. You know, quite opposite, one would say. Going from a very large and green and luscious, yet extremely cold landscape at times, to something that is very hot, and you know, it's the desert by the sea, by the Gulf, and it was quite the shift, I would say, coming from Toronto to there. Although I've traveled a lot, I've lived sporadically in different places, and you know, in a way, very much fed into this imaginative idea, because you know, going there at first I didn't know much about the place. It was not yet made the news as much as it has today. So you know, I was entering just like almost in a way Sable Island, where you know, it was kind of this landscape that was unfamiliar, and it was at the time 10 years ago untouched. It was just, I mean, it had been developing already, and I mean, it's been there for a long time. You know, it has a longer history also before the country was established, you know, in the early 70s. But I had landed just before the boom of construction and development, and in a way, the landscape to me was this story being developed in front of my eyes.
When you landed, and here you are, never been there before, what struck you?
Well, the first thing that struck me was the heat. It was like putting my head into an oven, you know, that massive heat that just comes out at you. And contrast. There are a lot of, you know, contrasts. You know, first there's a cultural contrast that I had to adapt to and understand. And that was, you know, that as a teacher, that's, you know, that becomes the fascinating thing, the learning process that you go through, because I was also teaching students from a whole different culture, you know, and more an Eastern culture as well as that they're Muslim. So I had a lot to understand and learn, and I still am. So the other thing that struck me was this landscape, both the natural and the urban. The natural being sand, and a lot of it. You know, the arid desert. I call it the arid sea, because in a way these dunes are like waves where they were, you know, and it was once covered, and it was underwater. So I felt I was living between two seas.
Atlantis in reverse.
Yes. Atlantis in reverse is a good way to put it.
Not to mention camels and BMWs.
Yes, and that was the thing. Here you go, I'm driving to work, and a group of camels start crossing. You have to stop, because it's illegal to hit a camel, get charged. But it was also fascinating. It was like a story out of a book coming alive. Here you are on an urban street, and then a bunch of camels are walking by. So, you know, it was fascinating at the time. And then there were the fantastical things that were also being built. You know, it was already, they had already done the dredging, but the Palm Island, you know, so start talking about Atlantis, and here you go, this shape of a palm extruding out from the mainland is quite fascinating. Where do you get to experience much of this kind of development in the world? You know, and coming from a place background like Italy, where things were built a long, long time ago, and there's not much more room to build such ideas. But here I am in this ever-changing landscape, and one that was changing quite rapidly. So it's like a stream, a rapid stream, growing up all around me.
Building. You've had quite a lot of responsibility and authorship in the building of the visual art program at Zayed University. And the university, of course, is dedicated to the enlightenment and education of young women, especially. Tell me about that experience for you.
Yeah, I mean, the university, Zayed University, was established in 1998, so quite a young university compared to most universities around the world. But it was, for me, it was a great opportunity to bring my knowledge and my experience into a place that was looking to the future. I think I've had a great education in the arts. And I had, by the time I got there, a lot of experience professionally that I could bring to a community that was developing.
Were they ready for it?
I don't think so. But things were changing so rapidly that, no one's ever ready for change. It takes a long time to change also things in a community. But there was, but a change was palpable. You could feel it, and there was a desire for that. And there was a lot of opportunity because things were not yet established. So creativity, or the possibility to use and try something out, or to establish something new, where you didn't have to stay within the peripheries of something already established, particularly in academia, was amazing.
Did it change you?
For sure. I think, experience changes someone, and hopefully for the better. But it did change how I looked at teaching and what was important in what was being taught. For example, theory. And, when I was going to, OCAD and Concordia University, we were looking at theory, and a lot of French theory, and European theory, and Western theory. But there's also a lot of Eastern theory that I was never really exposed to, but, we soon realized becomes important in understanding, because it's a different way of looking at the world. So,
how did this change your feelings about, I don't know whether theory or your feelings about who you were, what you were doing in that place?
I think it made me have a broader scope of how to approach ideas, and in my own work, although I was already, but thinking about audience and who you're speaking to, I think that's how it's affected me, and for, I think, different artists, they'll be attracted for their ideas and their approach to something more specific. And for me, it looked at, how do my ideas change in the landscape that I'm working in? And how can I also speak to more, in more broader terms? Or how do those stories of the East integrate with my stories from the West? And, but this East-West idea are also, I think, a bit also intangible in a way, because, where's really East and West, and what was interesting in the landscape of Dubai, there's this merging of ideas and culture, because people from all over the world were coming to Dubai because it needed a great workforce in a way to help develop at a rapid pace this place.
I'm reminded that pearl diving was, in former times, a large part of the Gulf's economic base, I guess. Pearl diving, that's kind of magical in itself. Did you feel that being in Dubai, being in the Gulf, in a sense was, there's the arid sea, as you say, on the one side, and then there's the sea on the other side. And here you are on the shore, as it were. And again, we seem to be coming back to water, one way or another, the idea of water, perhaps. Did this have an effect in your thinking about your own work, Janet, and the degree to which the fluidity, the sense of our being liminal? Did you have a feeling that this, when you were there, that this reinforced your thoughts about who you were as a storyteller?
Yeah, definitely. Actually, it made me think more about it. Maybe because in a way, there was space more, both visually and opportunity to think about these things. I was also working within a culture where storytelling, particularly oral storytelling and poetry, is a big part of their history. So it made me look at and compare the two, and I could actually relate to that, and how to bring that out even within my students, where they can use that as their mechanism. So I did find it kind of, I was at the edge, so to speak, and it definitely allowed me to think about, what was I next taking on and integrating into, and which those things sometimes will come out later in time. But I started to think about the landscape there, and started integrating that into my work. So I think the development of Dubai and the rapid growing place, and the idea you brought about pearl diving, that's magical in itself. I wish I could go and dive for pearls.
We'll try this at home.
Yeah, no, exactly. So, that's.
Clearly, Janet, you live and work in an incredible international context that one might even, from some perspectives, see as exotic. Certainly, an environment, an international context that many artists can only imagine for themselves, and you're living it. But you're living it, of course, that's the plus side, you're living it embedded within the international art system. And we all know that the art system is a highly politicized environment, and so it takes some guts to work within it and to maybe, sort of float through it, if I can use a water metaphor, without sinking. So I'm kind of curious, how do you work within this system without sinking?
Well, it's hard. Sometimes you're patching up the boat all the time. But, I had, again, Dubai's given me a great opportunity to bring what I already know coming from Toronto and working in an environment where, the politics of art and the system was already quite in place. In Dubai, it was just starting and growing. In some regards, I try not to think about it too much. Otherwise, I think, it's kind of like when you never really drown, but from what I've read and heard, it's like, if you start falling into that deep sleep and you forget to tread water anymore. And I play different roles, and that's kind of how I work, and I think float through the system, because it's more my interest of what's happening in the art world, so to speak. And I've met a great deal of people throughout my years practicing as an artist and traveling. And I think my travels helped me a lot to weave through these various systems. And I'm not too concerned about or I don't spend my time about becoming the superstar. But my main interest is I want to get my ideas out there, and I'll do what I can to make that happen. And a lot of times, it's a responsibility I take upon myself to make that happen.
Mm-hmm.
And at times I've been lucky, and it's kind of like something happens, or you get taken up with the wind, and you grab on to things, or it's like you're at the edge of the water, and the wave, or there's a calm in the water, and you could see what's below it, and you could try to pick that up and see what can happen with it. And but part of my how I've been treading through this network, through this archipelago of art islands, is curiosity, as well as I try to also work or bring my work to places, or have my work bring me to places. Mm-hmm. So I connect and travel and movement with my work. And that's kind of how.
I mean, it's about picking up on a word that you used. I play many parts. That the model I'm feeling is that of a true actor, an actor's actor, as opposed to a movie star.
That's never thought of that. Well, you have to understand the roles that in order to work within the system. Mm-hmm. I've played the role of curator, played the role of artist, of administrator, of writer and editor, and those have affected each other's roles. I think overall at the end I see I'm the artist, and my different interests have led me to develop an idea or to learn about something through these different roles.
One last question. Through all of this, it can be hard to remember who you are, apparently, but you don't seem to have a problem. So I must ask, what remains real for you, Janet, through all of these permutations that you experience and which you take on? How do you understand what is real?
That's the hardest question I think you've asked me. And what is real? I mean, and today we're so much bombarded with so many things that, I do question what I'm working with or where I'm going, because, there's always these messages around us, both physically, because of social media, then, advertising on the street, or, and, I think in earlier times people didn't have as much to decipher. It's kind of like fog. You kind of have to, find, where the headlights to find your way. So, I think, again, there's a lot that's real and unreal at the same time. I know being here right now talking about my work is pretty real, and what I do is real because I'm passionate about it, and it's what I want to do in the long run. Mm-hmm. So where I might go and how I'll end up there, and what I'll take with me, is to see. But I've had quite the interesting experience that all come with stories in their own right.
And parting the fog seems to get us back to water.
Yes, always back to water. And it's, water makes up most of our bodies. We're connected through water, through the whole world. And it's been a very strong metaphor. And physically, it's also something that's fragile, I think, that we think about. So for me, it's also weaves through my imagination and becomes that element that I use to bring me through my work.